I'll just wait till they call it out.
Again, I think holds legal relocation.
Hi, good evening ladies and gentlemen. My name's Lindsay, I'm the events coordinator here at Mountain View. It's lovely to see so many of you here. We've also got our online audience, so hello to anyone who's watching us online. So before we start this evening, we'll just get the housekeeping notes out of the way. So if there is anybody here using a hearing aid, if you switch it to the T mode. If you have a mobile phone, please either turn it off or make it silent. And finally, if the fire alarm goes off, we're not anticipating it to this evening, but if it does, make your way to the nearest fire exit, and then the muster point is in the bottom car park. If you're not totally sure, just follow somebody who looks like they know what they're doing. So on to the important bit tonight, what you've all come for. So I'm delighted to welcome Chris Gledhill this evening to present Abandoned in Cyberspace, Why Digital Identity Matters to You. Chris is the MD and founder of PDMS Limited and has shaped and driven the way the company has grown over the last 25 years, from humble beginnings to what is now a large, well-respected and innovative provider of strategic business systems. So as you can see, he's got plenty of skin in the game. But we didn't come here to listen to me this evening, so without further ado, I'd like to welcome our presenter this evening, Chris, to the stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. And so, yes, our subject is abandoned in cyberspace, and I hope that over the course of this presentation I'll be able to perhaps make some sense of that title and put it into a kind of context as to why I think we could be doing things an awful lot better as a nation, as a society almost, and as a technology industry as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to start by talking about some existing technologies. Passports. I have a passport here. It's quite battered. It has quite a few characteristics which are very interesting, and it's something we're all pretty familiar with. So it has, for example, it has a biometric. That photo, believe it or not, is me, a rather younger, slightly less cheerful me, because you're not allowed to smile on photos, as we know, for passports. It has some cryptography. It actually has a chip in there somewhere. Don't know what it's used for very much, but it is a sort of at least a nod to the digital age. It has a token, a biometric token, something I can replicate quite easily in the form of my signature, which will help perhaps to identify me in certain circumstances. It's on quite complicated paper, so a lot of technology, printing technology, goes into trying to make this as secure as possible so that it can't easily be forged. And it has some attributes, in this case my date of birth. Now, obviously my date of birth tells you quite a few things about me. It's quite useful if you're wanting to impersonate me or steal my identity. It's also quite useful if you want to know how old I am for some regulatory or other purpose. But obviously my age and my date of birth aren't quite the same thing. It's also an incredibly useful document. I mean, however secure you may think this is, it's basically the key for me to doing pretty much anything related to travel, pretty much any serious, important financial interaction or transaction I might want to undertake. If I want to engage a lawyer, then I have to go through a KYC process, which this is central to. If I want to get married, hire a car, whatever else, people basically take this little booklet as being the proof that I am who I say I am. And that very old, 10-year-old almost, piece of biometric data, which is that photograph, as being a sufficient cross-check to make sure that the person presenting and that document are the same. It's also the very embodiment of a standard, okay? This is the same, pretty much. I mean, I know we're all going to have the very exciting innovation of the blue version very shortly. Some people may be quite excited about that. I think it's just a bit of it's window dressing. And as you can see, this picture shows that, you know, right across the world, very different nations with very different political systems and very different ideas about what identity is and how it should be controlled and so on, basically all conform to a standard that is not actually centrally managed or updated. It's done by consent across and essentially convention by lots and lots of different agencies. But still, I can hire a car or cross a border pretty much anywhere in the world using this as the primary source of my identity, because essentially it looks just like a North Korean passport, if such a thing exists. We were just talking about North Korea earlier on, or a German one, or a French one, or an American one, or whatever. And so I want to talk a little bit about the technologies. There are some very important, very successful technologies that this is based upon. Pen or printing. It's the signature I did with a pen. You know, printing allows us to create this very, very specific format and so on, and to produce them very quickly in a mass-produced sort of way. It has the photo, which is probably the biometric we're most familiar with. It's issued by a trusted authority. That's really, really important. We all know that only the Passport Office can issue one of these for us that's going to be any use to us, unless we are particularly good at forging. And similarly, there is a chip in there, so there is at least a nod to the digital world in this document as well. So those technologies are what I think of as general purpose technologies. And I think that's an important concept in this, because this quote from a guy called Eric Bryn-Johnson, who is if you're interested in reading, in the economics of the digital world, he's a good person to look up. But the idea of general purpose technologies and the impact they have is very important in this. And pen and paper, or paper and the printing press, are sort of brilliant examples of general purpose technologies that have been around an awfully long time and have actually driven economic innovation. And if you think about it, all of the major transactions we undertake in our lives, buying a house, sort of buying a car, getting insurance, whatever it happens to be, they're all basically they're made possible almost by the way that these technologies have been adapted to allow us to provide legal certainty, to keep records and so on. So general purpose technologies are an important concept. And now we're going to do a little experiment, because we're going to just explore the limits of this particular set of general purpose technologies. And I think we're going to just hand out some sheets now. And what I'd like everybody to do is to forge Mark Zuckerberg's signature for me. Okay? And there is a prize for this. Okay? There is a prize. And I'm intending to hand out a fine-ish bottle of wine to the most successful forger amongst you. And for those of you who are watching this online, I have an apology. Okay? Unfortunately, those of you who are doing this online can't participate in this. You can't participate in this because you're not in the room, and I can't give you one of my special forms, which has a signature on and which I can evaluate. But you also can't participate online because actually you'd have access to tools which I can't control. You could use Photoshop, or you could use a number of digital tools which would make it too easy for you. So apologies for that. Feel free to actually have a go anyway, but you won't be part of the competition, and I'm afraid that fine-ish bottle of wine is not available to you. So obviously you can use your initiative here. I mean, you may wish to just freehand forge that signature. There may be other things that you can try and do and collaborate. It may even be possible to see the signature through a piece of paper, making it rather easier to trace. Use your initiative is what I'm saying. Would I even know whether the one you give me is one you forged yourself or the one I printed out for you in the first place? Okay, so whilst we're just finishing off our forgeries, I've got a box of cookies as well, by the way, but that's for something else. Lindsay's doing a great job here of collecting in, and Lindsay, if you give them all to Jim, then that's fantastic. Thank you very much for joining in. Now, the point of that, amongst other things, apart from being a bit of fun, is to just highlight perhaps that even the most successful general technologies have their limitations, and I suspect that there's not one single one of those signatures which wouldn't go straight through the check system if you put it on a check, because actually it's really hard to check a physical signature in an automated and high-speed way. So the point is that it's a bit like, if you think of it as a little bit like the wheel. The wheel is a fantastic general purpose technology, and and over the years we've got faster and faster and better at exploiting it, but it can't leave the ground very easily. So if you want to fly somewhere, you don't need a wheel, you need an aerofoil, a totally different general purpose technology. And we live in a digital world now, and I think the things that have been so successful at helping us to build our whole commercial and social world and to manage things and to provide and to ensure that we comply with laws and all that kind of thing have their limitations in the digital world. And I think, recent couple of years have really shown just how vulnerable some of those systems are, or also how quickly they can be replaced with other things when the need is there. So we're going to talk about digital identity. And the question is, the first question if you're going to talk about digital identity is, well, what is digital identity? So I had a bit of a look around the internet, as you do, and I came up with this definition, and I'd like you to just feast your eyes on that and just take in what that is saying. I mean, this is from Techipedia, it was one of the simpler definitions I found. And if you didn't really feel like you understood that well, you're not alone, I didn't either. Okay, not really very helpful. And I think digital identity is something that gets talked about a lot, but not necessarily understood all that well. And it's seen as a technology topic. And what I want to do now is I want to talk about what digital identity means. I'm not going to talk about technology at all. What I want to do now, and in my next little interaction, and I've got a couple of friends, I hope, in the audience who are going to help me, just act out a couple of scenarios which are very familiar, but not necessarily, but just to think about how they might operate in a digital way. So, for the first one, unfortunately, I've been very generous in theory in offering that fine-ish bottle of wine, but I forgot to bring it with me. I'm really, really sorry, but you never know, I might be able to rectify the situation. So is there anybody in the audience who could sell me a fine-ish bottle of wine at all?
Yeah, I've got a bottle of wine, Chris.
Oh, fantastic. That's a relief. It would have been really embarrassing if I hadn't had one after making all these promises. So can you sell that to me, please?
In theory, yes.
In theory?
Well, I need to know that you're definitely you, and I need to know that you're over 18 before I can sell you some wine.
Okay, so how am I going to prove that to you online?
Well, you could use an identity provider or an authenticator of some sort.
Oh, that's fantastic, because I happen to know one of those.
Okay.
There's a friend of mine called the Max Identity Framework who is also in the house. So, Miff, would you please be so kind as to tell my friend, the purveyor of fine-ish wines?
Absolutely, Chris. I know who you are.
Yeah.
I know Chris Gale, and he's
I
definitely
trust you
older
more than
than
I
18.
trust him.
Do you trust me?
I do trust you.
So,
He's older than 18.
Okay.
Please
And-
give him the wine.
and actually, so if my friend, the purveyor of fine-ish wines, can come up and give me my bottle, that's absolutely wonderful. That means that somebody is actually going to get the promised prize. But there's another little subtlety there that I'd like to just point out, because had I had to show this, then Jim, because it's Jim, would have known that I'm actually very, very old. Okay? And he doesn't need to know that. He doesn't need to know what day I was born, or what century, decade I'm in. He needs to know that I'm over 18, because he needs to know that so that he can comply with a law that says he must not sell alcohol to anybody who's underage. That's a legal duty that he has, and he wants to be absolutely certain that he is actually complying with that, because his license depends on it, because he's a responsible member of society, for lots of good reasons. But he doesn't need to know how old I am, he just needs to know that I'm over 18. So in that transaction, rather than tell him a lot of information he doesn't need to, which equally he might be able to use for things like identity fraud and so on, I didn't need to do that. He only found out that I was over 18. That was the answer to a specific question, which was the minimum information required for that to comply with his legal duties. So that's a fairly simple scenario, but one which reflects lots and lots of different situations. But moving on to something perhaps just a little bit more sensitive, and as those who know me well, as my wife would tell you, I'm a bit of a hypochondriac, and I have been rather overindulging in some of that fine-ish wine recently, and my liver's a little bit sore, and I'd kind of like to get somebody to check it out. because I'm worrying about it, let's face it, and you know. So I'd quite like to know if there's a pimp in the room. Sorry, a pimp. I obviously mean a private independent medical practitioner. So is there in fact a pimp in the room?
I'm one of those too, as well as selling wine.
That's fascinating, fascinating. So the seller of wine has a sideline in checking out people's livers, and there's a thing. Free enterprise at its very best. So Jim, in your new role, or your additional role, could you please check me out? I really appreciate it. It'll just reassure me that I've not been overindulging in your other product. Is that okay? And is there anything that you need from me to allow me to do that? Any other information?
Well, I'd need to verify your identity, really. And also the other thing that would be useful would be maybe to get access to some blood tests or medical records that you had previously with your GP.
Okay, well, my GP sees me quite regularly because of that other characteristic I mentioned before of hypochondria. And yes, she has tested my blood quite a few times. Now, is my GP around at all?
That'd be me.
That'll be you. Well, would you be so kind as to pass on to the PIMP, private independent medical practitioner, my blood test details?
No, sorry, I don't know who you are.
Oh, so you don't trust me? Oh, okay. Who do you trust?
I trust MIF.
You trust MIF? Okay, so if I were to ask MIF to verify who I was, would you be prepared to pass on those medical details?
Yes.
Okay, so MIF, would you be just kind as to just tell Trish to pass my medical details on to Jim?
GP, I know who he is. It's Chris Gledhill, and you can pass the medical details on.
Here are Chris's medical details.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so can we do that?
Yes.
just now?
When do you want to come in?
Fantastic.
Have a glass of wine while you wait.
Okay, so the characteristics of that little pantomime, and it is intentionally, and it's an oversimplification in some ways. It's not intended to be technical, but what I'm trying to show there is that what we did there was a dialogue. Okay, there was a conversation there between trusted parties, where there were some privileged things that happened, but it was done, and the idea of this is in digital terms, is that that's something that can be done in a highly automated way between using established channels of communication and established trust relationships in a way which basically allows things which are currently very difficult to do and actually make things like the delivery of medical services. And I think there'll be plenty of people in the room who maybe have experienced how, even within the National Health Service, information often doesn't go where you want it to quite as quickly as you'd like, or as is in the interest of the patient. So there are lots of things currently which we make quite difficult simply because we don't have a framework which allows us to exploit digital technology in our own interests. So, in a nutshell then, what I've just described, or we've just acted out if you like, is a conversation between trusted parties executed digitally. I didn't execute it digitally, but the idea is to show something that can be emulated very quickly in a digital world, where only necessary and up-to-date information was exchanged. In the case of the buying the bottle of wine, it was only that I was over 18, not my age or date of birth, for example. And in the case of the medical records, it was, again, not necessary for MIF, the entity provider, to know anything about my medical records. Those attributes are none of his business. He was just proving that it was me, somebody else who I trust with my medical records. It was under my control. I always got asked. And it had, or should have, the privilege of legal certainty, or providing legal certainty. And at the end of the day, we rely incredibly heavily on this very insecure technology at the moment. And because we're used to it, we just take it for granted that that's okay. Turning up somewhere to prove who you are with one of these and a couple of utility bills, it's not really particularly secure. The biometrics and the other aspects of it are incredibly long-lasting, and again, the value of those erodes or decays very quickly in reality. But we're used to it, so we rely on it. And the parties to it are quite simple too. Effectively, there were three types of parties to all of those things. There's the authentication provider, and the title of this talk, Abandoned in Cyberspace, I just want to sort of briefly explain where that's coming from. We're used to the fact that the state provides us with all sorts of services and to some extent constraints and regulations and things we need to comply with. And we're used to the fact that this is just one of those. You know, we need it if we're going to travel. We need it if we're going to, you know, do any of the things, any of those, you know, open a bank account, whatever else. We just accept that. And it's a service we expect them to provide, and we expect it to be done in a way which complies with international standards so that it actually does work when we're trying to go on holiday and that kind of thing. Now, my view is that in the world of cyberspace, we've been almost completely neglected in that respect. You know, the way in which services are provided by government has simply not kept up. And as far as I'm concerned, I see that, and consequently, many of the services that we rely on are not as good as they could be. And medical is a really good example of that, where actually it's not as easy for services to be provided quickly, efficiently, you know, with the right information available at the right time, as it should be in the modern world. So whilst there is lots of, you know, people are often concerned about the abuse of power and the abuse of data and so on, I actually think that, you know, the problem is lack of a willingness to engage with the problem at all and actually use technology well and ensure that it's done in an auditable and essentially compliant way, because actually it could be a lot more secure. So there are some principles here. I think the digital identity ought to be a free and voluntary service. It has to be legally recognised. It should be universally accepted. It's got to be standards-based, just as the passport is. It should be international and it should be interoperable. And that's not just my opinion, okay? And it's not particularly something that's pie in the sky either, because actually this is the way they're doing it in Europe and have been doing for quite some time. So in Europe, across 500 million consumers and you know, and businesses and many languages and so on. They've had in place since 2015 something called EIDAS, which is the standard or a legal basis, that's a set of regulations essentially, that says that you have to be able to accept digitally signed documents across the whole of the EU, and that's been extended in 2021 to a requirement to build digital identity systems which essentially are entirely transparent and reusable across the whole of the EU, so that you can use your Belgian digital ID, for example, to open a bank account in Finland or in Estonia or in Germany or whatever else, and that there is a legal requirement for those to be accepted. So this isn't something which is pie in the sky. This is the way that you know, that the major trading blocks, and it's not just the EU either, are, I mean, this is highly prevalent across Asia as well now, in sort of in the more advanced Asian economies and so on. The idea that you should be able to use a digital identity to actually access services in a more efficient and more convenient and in a more and a simpler, more productive way. So this is taken directly from the European Commission website. And again, if you're interested in following up on any of this, then looking at some of these, you know, looking at the European Commission website on the ID is a great place to look. Looking at some of the other things Mr. Brynjolfsson said is quite interesting. But Europe aims to power business and people in a human-centred, sustainable and more prosperous digital future. They talk about a digital decade between now and 2030, and they are setting themselves some very ambitious goals for that. And this is a friend of mine, Anders Sutt, a friend of mine. He's looking very pleased with himself because he started down this road in 2002, around about the same time as the Isle of Man passed the Digital Transactions Act, which we have been ignoring ever since. And we're actually currently there's been a consultation recently about whether we're going to carry on ignoring it for a bit longer, or whether we're actually going to start complying with our own rhetoric there. But Estonia went down this road. We really started down this road in 2002, and they are already basically able to provide 100% of their key public services and have at least an 80% uptake on digital ID with their citizens, which is the targets for the EU for the end of this decade. So he's looking pretty pleased with himself because the Estonian economy has benefited very greatly from this. And also, this is one of the reasons they did it. Estonia is as by their own admission, they're a small, cold country with some very dangerous neighbours. So they kind of recognise that it's not necessarily going to be driving their economy. It's not necessarily going to be about getting lots of people to come and live in Estonia. It's about being able to make it really easy to do business with Estonia. So they have the concept of the electronic citizen, which in no way requires you to be an Estonian citizen and live in Estonia. It just means you have to prove who you are to the Estonian using their technology platforms once, so that you can then open a company, do business, sign legal papers, whatever else, in relation to transactions hosted in Estonia without ever going there. And if you think about a small, slightly cold little rock in the middle of the Irish Sea, then being able to do business with lots of people around the world very easily without them having to come here has some attractions, especially if you think that having a finance sector is a good idea. So there we go, Mr. Sutt, very pleased with himself. And so, finally, that brings us to some Isle of Man perspectives. And I've taken this statement directly from the Department for Enterprise website. Okay? So the Isle of Man is a leading international business centre, renowned for its innovation, professionalism, and long-standing policy of positive engagement with international initiatives and standards. And I applaud that. I just think we ought to get on with it. And I think that the ideas that we've been discussing here and the things that were enshrined in the 2002 Electronic Transactions Act, which Estonia then did, and we then didn't, would serve us very well if we were to look at them again. So, what's it about? Why bother? And really, it is about ease of doing business. It's about convenience, essentially. It's about productivity of local service providers. It's about government productivity. It's about being able to do business internationally without necessarily having to bring people here. It's about governance, compliance, and crime prevention, because these technologies are more secure, or should be, and can be, more secure than their paper-based alternatives, simply because you don't have to let your biometrics get 10 years out of date before you renew your passport. You don't have to give information that's not directly relevant to the specific transaction you're doing and so on. You don't have to share as much. And they're essentially a lot more environmentally sustainable as well, because you can drive economic growth without having to necessarily drive population growth, without having to drive without having to get people to travel anywhere near as much, without having to print as much paper. There are a whole load of reasons why this is a more sustainable approach as well. And that is it, apart from the fact that it's now time for those questions. And I think Lindsay's going to come and help me now, protect me perhaps.
So if you'd like to ask a question online, if you just pop it into our YouTube chat there, and we'll endeavour to get to them. Anybody in the room like to ask a question?
Yeah, it's just a very quick one. UK law, or within, you obviously talked a lot about European law and countries like Estonia being digital citizens. Have there been any cases, or are there any active cases in UK law at the moment, or on the island? So for contracts and signing and stuff like that.
In the UK, it's they're almost to the point where pretty much any contractual transaction is acceptable digitally. So they've done it, and the other thing to bear in mind is that UK is signed up to the IDAS. So the European rules that I was talking about, UK is a signatory to those rules. It was as part of the EU, but they're retaining compliance. They've taken the entire EIDAS regulations into UK law as part of the Brexit process.
So how do individuals or So how do individuals or companies register with the IDAS regulations, or how?
Well, there are lots of different. I mean, there are lots of different initiatives around it, but essentially, if you know, for the vast majority of things, there's not even a requirement to register anything. If you want to do business in the UK and you use, for example, any of the sort of standard e-identity or e-signing products, that is legally acceptable. And so, and you know, and if you want to go into any more detail, within EIDAS, there are sort of advanced and qualified signatures and various other mechanisms that are described. So and there are some areas where, just to give you an example, for some specific transactions which are highly regulated, the Isle of Man Ship Registry, which has to comply with international maritime regulations, when they pass information around about the qualifications of seafarers, which have to go to Singapore so that somebody can board a supertanker or whatever it happens to be, they use qualified digital signatures provided by an organisation called Global Sign, which is essentially a partners with Adobe, and the government has a certificate which is built into the ship registry system, so that automatically allows those documents to be signed and tamper evident when they go out there. So there are lots and lots of use cases which may be quite specific to a particular requirement, but there's also a general acceptance of things like DocuSign or eSign, or all of them offer products which essentially which offer several different levels of security, and you know, if you ever check, they'll tell you what they're compliant with.
Do we have any other questions?
I like the idea of just being able to verify yourself once with somebody and then not having to take along wetting copies of things and put passports in the post and all the other things that are kind of high risk. But I think one thing that concerns me and would concern a lot of people is it's one thing to have a physical passport that you're carrying around and you're looking after. It's another thing to have trusted all your identity into some database somewhere governed by fallible people, who might leave them lying around and, not be very password secure. What could you do to make that more comforting?
I mean, the first thing is it's about standards, isn't it? And I think that it's always going to be legitimate to make sure that the trust you endow into organisations is justified. But we already do it. The banks look after our money, whether we like it or not, based on fallible systems. And they all operate to a greater or lesser extent with EID. And in fact, this device is 100 times more secure than that paper one. And actually, even through COVID and so on, we've all, and with banking apps and all sorts of things, we're already doing digital identification and digital transactions in a relatively chaotic way right now. And I think the inevitable point, I think, is that some of this, and particularly the bit which is about identity assurance as opposed to sign-on, for example, or the specific services of individual organisations, that component of it is the thing that I think needs to be stepped up. And I think that's what the EID schemes in Europe, for example, are recognising, because they're saying, actually, it's not a commercial service to provide identity, and it doesn't make sense to try and get Barclays Bank. The UK Verify scheme that has just been canned, which cost £500 million or so, was all about trying to get the banks, the post office and all sorts of other people to provide EIDs just for government use, for access to government services. They've canned that now because it was misconceived commercially, because the idea was to monetize the provision of ID. What we're saying, or what I'm saying, is that this is something that is an essential service to the citizen, which clearly needs to be done well, but ultimately the technology is there, and there is a concentration of risk, but there's also a concentration of capability if it's done in the correct way. And the other thing about and actually is written into the EU stuff, is that there has to be a mechanism whereby what happens if a system gets compromised. How do you deal with that? That's part of the regulations and the standards as well. What do you do? How quickly do you need to be able to rectify it? What's the process, and so on? And it's actually no different than, we do a lot of high stakes things online already, and this is really about making it better organised, more standardised and more accessible.
Can I ask another question? Sorry. Something else that occurs to me is if this is a voluntary thing, and you say there's been 80% uptake in Estonia, what happens to the other 20% of people? Are they going to end up being edged out because they haven't subscribed to this thing? You know, are people going to be so tailored towards doing this digital thing that, you know, your old age pensioner mother or whoever is going to end up not being able to do stuff because they can't do it digitally?
Again, it's a completely valid question. And actually, the problem of digital divide is one of the things that's, and the digitally deprived, if you like, is one of the things that's held a lot of these things back. But one of the things to bear in mind with this is that it's to some extent my kind of contention on this is that it is actually society's job to make sure that people don't get left behind and that scarce resources are applied to solving the problems of those who need help, rather than doing everything less efficiently. So if 80% of us, and a growing percentage of us actually, this is nearly always going to be cheaper, more convenient, more timely, and less demanding on the service provider. There's less admin, there's less paper, things are less likely to go wrong. It's much less error prone, or should be if it's done properly. As with any, that's the judge. That's almost my criterion for judging whether an organisation has good IT. Don't look at their IT. How many mistakes do they make? And how good is their service? If they've got great service, they're highly competitive, and they don't make very many mistakes, they've almost certainly got good IT. Okay, so, and in the context of public services, which is what I think particularly what you're driving at, it's clearly important that people who can't access the primary mechanism are given the necessary support. That is a duty that we should expect to be fulfilled. And just because, and actually releasing resources by making the majority of that more efficient, it's up to us to hold government or whoever to account to ensure that they don't exclude people, and that's a regulatory challenge. But there's no reason to issue the benefits of doing things digitally for those who can use it that way, because we don't trust people to actually use those resources better to help people who need help.
Chris, we've got a question from Leon online, and he's saying, what is your opinion about self-sovereign identity, and how can it potentially assist the rollout of a true digital identity on the Isle of Man? Okay,
self-sovereign identity. I think the opinion I have here is really that the identity provider role is actually something which requires, which in order for it to really be accepted, there has to be some sort of authority behind it. There has to be some trusted, because it is about trust. And so there has to be a framework, and I think what I've described or tried to describe, and it's not in a very non-technical sense, is a framework for a dialogue and for setting up trusted relationships. So to me, the most important concept here is trust. It's not, and in that sense, I mean, anything which is self-sovereign, which is independent of the trust framework, and there are lots of things around there, whether you look at blockchain-based things or various other things, which are predicated on the idea that nobody trusts anything, and for me, some of those technologies and ideas are really valuable, but I see the challenge actually as being about establishing the idea that we can trust named and known authorities, because we already do, and it's the way we work. So whether we like it or not, we do actually trust the police or the government or the NHS or whatever. And we kind of have to, and I think our job as a technology industry is to make them better and more trustworthy, rather than to say, oh, can't trust anybody, so let's not bother. So I think there are lots of interesting ideas there, but it's not, for me, the key problem.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end of our questions and answers session. I've probably got time for one more.
I've got one.
Okay.
I'm not a plant this time, I promise.
I was rather hoping you wouldn't let Trish ask the question, but never mind.
I just wondered if there's anything in the EID about a way of ensuring that an individual is unique. Or could I have my Isle of Man identity and my Estonian identity and do my dodgy beneficial? You know, it doesn't solve the universal beneficial owner.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question, and I actually don't know the answer to it, by the way. So I think you probably win the cookies, which was my prize for somebody who asked me a technical question I really, really couldn't answer. But the and that's a techie joke, by the way. But my take on that, I haven't read enough into the specific standards around the new EID scheme to know how they're dealing with it. But I think it's almost certainly the case that there will be protections in there against precisely that, because that would be an obvious way for the system to be defrauded. And I think it may well be that it's actually very hard to create, just as that additional, just as it's quite hard to get multiple citizenships without actually jumping through an awful lot of hoops. You know, it's going to be very tied to that. So I suspect that it may not be a unique identity that's imposed across the whole of the EU as a sort of schema. I think it's more likely that it's just that each one, that the due diligence that's done to ensure that you legitimately are a Belgian, Estonian, Irish or whatever citizen are regarded as being sufficiently robust. Okay.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of the session, but Chris is going to be here afterwards, so if you didn't get a chance to ask your question or you want to speak to Chris quietly after, then he will be hanging around.
That is absolutely brilliant. Let's pretend it's Bake Off. Who's Amber Garrett? I'm going to give you a handshake. Mr. Zuckerberg and his metadata may be in danger.
Truth that using my phone.
Well, there you go, you see. You use technology. Fantastic. That's really, really good. I'm just going to show that to our online audience. How about that? That would definitely go through the check clearing system. There's no doubt about it. Thank you. And here's your bottle of wine.
Thank you.
Okay, so that draws our tech talk to a close this evening. I just want to thank Chris. I think we would all agree it's been a really informative and interesting evening. So if you wouldn't mind just putting your hands together in show of appreciation. So our tech talks are now going to be taking a short hiatus for Christmas. So we'll be back here in January with 3 more exciting speakers. If you have any subjects or speakers that you would particularly like to hear or hear about, then you will all receive an email this evening with a feedback form, and there's a section in there to let us know if there is anything specific that you'd like to know about. We really appreciate it when you take the time to complete the forms. It gives us a really nice insight back into what's working and, you know, what we can do to improve your experience. So really all that's left now is for me to wish you all a safe journey home and thank you all for coming.